Now we are recording. Welcome to the presentation of Professor Antonio Carpallo Bautista, Introduction to Medieval Spanish Mudéjar Bookbinding. Professor Antonio Carpallo Bautista holds a PhD from the Complutense University of Madrid and another from the University of Saragossa. He is an associate professor at the Faculty of Information Sciences at the Complutense University of Madrid, where he teaches courses on document analysis, rare books, and bookbinding, and he currently serves as the coordinator of the doctoral program. His research focuses on the study of artistic bookbindings. He co-directs the Bibliopedia Research Group at the University of Complutense Madrid and currently leads several projects dedicated to the study and digitization of artistic binding collections preserved in various Spanish and international institutions. Since he has been the principal investigator in 6 major research projects. Professor Carpallo also coordinates the collective catalog of artistic bookbindings and has curated around 20 exhibitions devoted to bookbinding and the history of the book. He is the author of more than 120 publications, including some 20 monographs, numerous book chapters, conference papers, and over 60 journal articles, many of which appeared in leading international journals. It has long been an open secret that the Jews of medieval Spain played a central role in the art of bookbinding and were instrumental in the development of the Mudéjar style. For this reason, we are delighted to welcome Professor Carpallo. His approach transcends faith or ethnicity. He treats all book artifacts as cherished expressions of a shared Spanish heritage. Professor Carpallo Bautista stands as one of the foremost authorities on the material culture of the Spanish book. Indeed, his scholarship has helped to define the filtrations, methodological frameworks, and even many of the descriptive terms that we will hear today bear the imprint of his discerning expertise. His meticulous cataloging of collections in Spain's most prestigious libraries and archives has set a benchmark for the discipline, while research filled from his student with generosity and rigor. Maimonides famously remarked that every translator is a liar. He exaggerated, of course, to make a point, but one feels the truth of it when attempting to render Professor Carpallo's elegant Spanish prose into English, a language that often lacks precise equivalents for many of Spain's decorative techniques and terms. For that reason, we owe a special debt of gratitude to our translator, Daniel Sherr, who has undertaken a kind of mini apprenticeship to bring Professor Carpallo's voice faithfully into English. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Antonio Carpallo Bautista.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to apologize for not making this presentation in English. I'm really sorry about that. I would really like to be able to speak in English in order to be able to have a closer relationship with all of you, but that's going to be impossible, and I must express my gratitude to Professor Jacobi, for this opportunity to be able to teach you what we in Spain have done in the studies that have been carried out on Mudéjar bookbinding. And I also want to express my gratitude to Daniel Sherr for supporting us so that everyone can have a translation from Spanish to English and hear what I'm mentioning to you. For me, it is a pleasure to have this conference in your university and in your department. It's an enormous honor to be able to transmit this knowledge about Mudéjar bookbinding, because now you'll see the surprise why these bindings, although they were called Mudéjar and they were viewed as Hispano-Arabic or Hispanic Muslim or Hispanic or Islamic, were not. They were done by Jewish Hebrew artisans. We have documentation in the Spanish archives that corroborates that, and I'll get into that a little more later. First, I want to indicate that this type of binding, this style, this decorative style, began in the Iberian Peninsula in what is now Spain and Portugal at the end of the 13th century through the first years of the 16th century, although its apogee, its greatest importance was reached in the 15th century. As we were saying, these bindings were carried out by Jewish artisans who were working in different cities of the Iberian Peninsula, very important places where there was a great bookbinding tradition, especially Mudéjar bookbinding in Toledo, in Barcelona, in Valencia, in Zaragoza, in Salamanca, in Segovia, in places where there was perfect coexistence between the Christian, Jewish, and Arabic culture. No problems, just like in Granada. There were frictions from time to time, but there was what is called convivencia, where everybody was able to live together. This type of decoration was also carried out at the same time as other types of decorations, such as the Gothic or Renaissance decorations at the beginning of the 16th century. We were saying that as very important centers were Toledo and Barcelona. As a matter of fact, there is archival documentations that indicate that the workshops for carrying out the bookbinding were run or owned by Jewish bookbinders, as we were saying. In Spain, we have a few places with a great number of Mudéjar bookbinding. For example, the National Library of Spain has the largest number of volumes with this type of decoration, with approximately 300 such volumes. I recall that when we were preparing the exhibit in 2013 with my colleague and friend Arsenio Sanchez Hernan Perez, one of the greatest restorers that we have in Spain and who worked in the National Library, we had to carry out more than 300, check out more than 350 bindings to pick out about 60, which were those that were put on exhibit in an exhibit called Leather on Cardboard in the National Library. And later, our classification, our most recent classification, the most complete study on Mudéjar bookbinding was generated, starting with that exhibit and the subsequent research. The Toledo Cathedral has about 250 Mudéjar bindings in its different categories, but it's also a place where we can find a large number of bindings. I'm not the first person to study Mudéjar bookbinding. Starting at the beginning of the 20th century, there were academicians who wanted to discover more things about Mudéjar bookbinding. Here we can see the names, I'm sorry, the last names of those bookbinders. Some of them were Spaniards, some were English. Goldschmidt, Thomas de Marinis was an Italian author, and then the rest were Spanish researchers. We can see the chronology from 1913 until the 21st century, where we can see some collaborations. And I was fortunate to be able to publish and study in different institutions. And that's why there are different years there, because of the type of publication, the date of publication of those studies of the different institutions where we worked with Mudéjar bindings. In terms of the exhibits, which I think were very important, because aside from the scientific studies that could be published and which reach a certain limited number of specialists, the exhibits are a way of disseminating knowledge aside from to researchers to the general public, so they can become familiarized with these types of decorative styles, where they're from, who did them, what techniques were used. And it seems to me important to hold these type of exhibits. We also need to go to the first third of the 20th century to 1934, when two very important exhibits were held. After that, we had to wait practically 50 years until 1985, 1992 to see another exhibit where, in addition to decorative styles from the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, there was also a special section devoted to 15th century bindings, and specifically to Mudéjar bindings. We had to wait to the beginning of the 20th century for the University of Valencia to devote an exhibition to the Italian bindings. That is to say, bindings that were done specifically, above all, in Naples, when it was Spanish territory with Neapolitan kings, when under Alfonso V, the Magnanimous, and later the Duke of Calabria, created a great collection of bound books, which were bound by Catalan and Aragonese artisans, mainly Jewish, who worked in Naples and who took the different techniques from Spain to Naples. And there they included gold as part of the binding. We will see bindings that were embossed with the dry embossing technique, but in Naples, they began to use gold for embossing the cover. In 2005 and 2009, I had the opportunity to study the bindings of my university, of the Historical Library of the Complutense University, the second most important library in Spain after the National Library. And I had a project to do research in the Toledo Cathedral, where I was able to study, in addition to studying many different styles of bindings, I was able to focus on 15th century Mudéjar bindings. The National Spanish Library has many such bindings, but because of the laws of the dispossession of the church assets in the 19th century, it was the state ended up with a lot of these. But in the Toledo Cathedral, many of the bindings belong to the cathedral itself, and that is worth special mention. And perhaps the most interesting or study on Mudéjar binding is what I did along with my colleague Arsenio Sanchez in 2013, which was called Leather on a Table, Mudéjar bindings in the National Spanish Library. And we came up with a catalog that brought together different expert studies on Morisco Arab books. And we there included a catalog of different irons, a corpus of motifs that were used for the decoration of the covers. And that was an important step forward. In terms of the decorative techniques that we would use for the Mudéjar, one of these techniques was the cold embossing. That is to say that we would emboss a decorative iron on the leather of the cover, but it would be cold. The image of the iron and the power of our arm would leave an image. The second technique would be the dry embossing, which with the same technique, you moisten the leather, you take the iron, you heat it up a little bit, and with that heat and the power of our arm, we would stamp the image of the iron on the cover, on the leather. The third technique, which we would find, would be the gold plating. This was done above all in Naples, which belonged to Spain because of the viceroys. And they would use gold leaves, which a gold filament, which was put on top of the hot iron, so which would leave a that golden surface. It was also possible to paint the gold on, but that was more in the Arab bookbinding. Some places we find a small mosaic, that is, small bits of leather of different colors, which were added on top of the cover, but that was less frequent. More frequent were reliefs. That is, on a smooth surface, you would have indentations or um, emergence from the leather. If you ran your finger over the leather, you would see that there was an unequal surface. The relief would mean that the person who would see it would see certain elements standing out because they were a little higher than the rest of the surface. As terms of the tools that were used at the end of the 15th century, you can see what is in the image. This is called a goat's foot, but it's really not a goat's foot. It was made of bronze. It had one or two threads, and since there was no wheel at the time, the only way to stamp these images um, on the cover was using this tool. Since there was no wheel, the wheel came later. It appeared at the end of the 15th century, like 1470 approximately, and that's when we began to find wheels. That is a circular element where there was a decorative element which was constantly repeated on the weather, just like it was a bicycle wheel. And it meant that the decoration could be done much more quickly. But in the Mudéjar bindings, there are very few wheels. Just at the end of the 15th century, the beginning of the 16th century, everything else was done with scattered irons that had a decorative element which was stamped on to the cover. And that's how the entire cover was covered. And it was enormous work. It required a great deal of dedication. It required a very well-developed technique. As characteristics, the most important characteristics of this type of binding, we could see that great Morisco and Muslim influence, although there were Jewish workshops. This was called Hispano-Arabic, as covering a sort of goat skin called cordovan. It was sort of dark skin, sort of purplish. It was for a support for the cover. A type of cardboard or paperboard was used, paper compressed to provide a strong substrate for the cover. And on top of the cover, we added paper, which would later be decorated with those irons I mentioned before. We talked about the different decorative techniques. We had the cold and dry embossing and the gold embossing at the end of the 15th century. Around 1480 is when we began to see the gold bindings in Naples. A schema, used very commonly in Mudéjar art, was these lace patterns. It was a sort of thread which had a cord form, as you can see in this image here. In terms of the classification, the most important classification that we have on Mudéjar bindings, there were various classifications throughout the 20th century, depending on the researcher, but here we'll show the classification that we include in the 2013 study, where we did that exhibition on bindings in the National Library. The first group of bindings are those of the lacing patterns, that sort of band that form geometric pattern. There are three different categories. One is what we call the Toledo group, because very possibly that type of decoration was generated in Toledo. It shows, you see a central circle in the middle which was created by those threads that were intermeshed, and the rest of the space, which was empty, was filled up with small iron images with the embossing technique, the dry embossing, being that the iron was just a little hot. The most example one is the one in the middle from the National Library of Spain, which is the Toledo book for Mass. It was restored on the and this is how it was on the cover. That's the first group of these lace motifs, the Toledo group. Another group is what we call the Salamanca group, where we could think that it was created in Salamanca. Perhaps it's a type of decoration that might have been generated in that city or around that city by the artisans who were there. What did this group consist of? Well, it's just like the previous group, the Toledo group, but instead of having a central circle, or what we have are threads which cross each other and which form geometric compartments. For example, the central volume has 3 rhombus in the center area. In the right-hand binding, there are 2 squares, one on top and one on the bottom. And what we have on the left, you can see squares or rectangles, 6 of them, 2, 2, and 2. From the top going down, we can see those geometric forms, and that's why they're called Salamanca. And the third group in these lace patterns, which were intermeshed, here's some more examples of the Salamanca group, and you can even see a drawing of how all those threads and the empty spaces were filled with small irons, images made by the irons. And we were saying that the third group are those that are called the Catalan Aragonese lace patterns. In the central one, we can see a circle in the form of a flower, as if they were the petals of a flower. A circle with 4 petals, and in the center, you could have a heraldic image. In the center, we have a black and white photo where you can see the shield of Barcelona. And then another one has a warrior's helmet, which was the symbol of the Marqués de Santillana on the right. He was a great book collector of the 15th century, and to indicate that he owned the books, using the relief technique, he added a helmet to indicate that these books belonged to him, the Marqués of Santillana. This would be a first group in our classifications of Mudéjar book bindings, those that had these lace patterns with those 3 subtypes that I just showed you, the Toledo, the Salamanca, and the Aragonese subtypes within this large group of lace patterns of Mudéjar book bindings. The second group, and perhaps the most numerous, is what we call the rectangular band category, because of these bands that ran around the book cover, carried and made by separate irons. There were no wheels. Everything was done by hand, one by one, to create those borders, which could become smaller as you went inside or towards the center of the cover. You can see this band running around the edges here. You can see multiple bands. I'm counting them with the pointer here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There could be a lot of these bands. In this case here, in this example on the right, we can see one band, and then we can see a circle with which is laid out in sort of a checkerboard or a chessboard. One is present, one is not, it's like a checkerboard. And just instead of black and white, we can see one place where the iron was placed and one place where it wasn't. And we call that in a checkerboard or a chessboard pattern. This metal aspect is quite interesting. This is the remains of a chain. This was the anti-theft mechanism that we had in the 15th century, and the chain got lost, but we still have that remain of the chain, which was inserted in the wooden cover in this case. That was the first group of bands that we have running around the cover. Another group, which hadn't been defined until 2013, was what we called the oblique bands. We had bands just as if they were uh, uh, threads in an inclined fashion. We can have a band which defines the cover into two. So you have one triangle on the top part and one triangle on the bottom part. Or in this case, you have two crisscrossing bands which create four smaller triangles. That would be these oblique bands or diagonal bands. This model we includes in the classification of bindings, since there was a sufficient number of them to determine that this was a significant decorative study. Here we can see another example, but just with the with a single division, one triangle on top and one triangle on the bottom, one here and one below. We don't have a, a crisscrossing band here as we did in the other examples where we created four triangles. Here, there's only one triangle and another triangle here if you follow the pointer. This would be another of the oblique band models. The other group is what we called a split rectangle, which is to say that the band running around the cover, it was divided into different parts. In these cases, we had a split rectangle whereby inside each space there is a geometric motif. Here we have a rhombus, here we have a star, and here we have the cover, the border, and the frame is divided into two, and here and also into two. We can see that this rectangle is also decorated instead of with a decorative form. It was just filled with small iron markings. Here we have a rhombus. Here we have an arc. Here we see that the rhombus marking is repeated. And here we have a simple, a rounded lace. And here we see the division in two, here in two. Here we can see the split rectangle was divided into three spaces, 1, 2, and 3. Here, there are four spaces, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Here we have one made up of 6 parts, just like the one we have here on the right. 6 parts. Also, we have seen bindings with divided to 9 spaces. That is to say that the central external framework was divided into 9 parts. 3, 3, and 3. That is the largest number of divisions that we have found. Another group of Mudéjar bindings, which we have in our classification, are those that only have one central motif, and that's what stands out. Here we find a circle, all of which was decorated with small iron markings with a decorative element that's embossed onto the cover. Here we have a sort of star with a iron that was repeatedly applied, and here we have another star which was created with that thread and everything that was decorated with small iron markings. All of these were luxurious bindings that were requested from the binder, and they were very expensive. They were artistic bindings. Behind what we see here, there was a great work of design at the beginning. You can't think that the binder just would show up and he would start placing irons on the cover without any thought. There was a previous design, and through sketches, these compositions were created. Another bindings with central motifs. Here we see a square in the center with circles joined by a rhombus. This binding that we see on the right is an Italian binding from Neapolitan. It was embossed. We know that because of this rose-shaped iron image here. It had a rose shape, and that iron that was used to emboss the cover in the rose shape, those bindings we know come from Naples. They're Neapolitan, and they were created in the 15th century. In the first decades, up to the end of the 15th century, we would have those elements with a rose shape to create these bands, these threads around the cover. We also had the bindings where the leather didn't cover everything, just part. And that part was the part that was covered was quite decorated. The classification that we've seen so far showed the central motif starting at this point. This is not the same classification. These were forms of carrying out these Mudéjar bindings where we found that part of the cover was covered with leather and the rest was bare with nothing. These are wooden covers, and this type of bindings, which were called half leather bindings, were used above all when there wasn't enough leather. So there was a scarcity of leather, scarce, and so uh, good use had to be made of the leather to do the bindings, and the best way to do that was to just use the binding to cover part of the book, the spine, and leave the rest untouched. Here we see some examples of that. See, can you see these holes, which are the remains of the chains, where we saw a metal vestige in the other examples? there were the metal was lost here, but we can see that there were the holes to hold the chains to keep the books from being stolen. And we see this metal part where the cursor is, which joins the wooden cover through small nails, which served to conserve the leather, so the leather wouldn't rub and 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 would neatly join the wood, and it would protect the leather from breakage. Here we can see a few more examples of this half leather binding with holes, as we saw here. Here we see the holes, and in some cases, we can even see some drawings on the wood. And this binding belongs to the Complutense University. And we should not forget that the Complutense University is a public university. It's a university where the books have been used. And since they've been used, someone might have used them and might not have used them properly and decided to draw on top of them. It's like graffiti on the covers. This is not a current graffiti. It's an old graffiti. We can see this book from the Complutense Library, this binding from the National Library, and this from the Toledo Cathedral. These were what we would call half leather bindings. And we can also see bindings where, as we said before, with the Duke of Calabria, where there was that helmet that showed the relief on the cover. We can find other bindings where we include other marks of ownership. In this case, these are the we can see the heraldry of a cardinal, and we can see another. This is from Naples. And we can see the symbol of Naples in the center. And this is from the Duke of Calabria. And the Duke of Calabria was responsible for getting all the books from Naples go to a monastery. And after the disposition of the church's assets, the government expropriated the church's assets. And that's why a lot of these books ended up at the public University of Valencia, but they came from that monastery. And before they had been in Naples with the Duke of Calabria. Here we can see this is what we showed you before with this binding in the form of a flower with a helmet in the beginning. Here we can see this repeated 4 times with the escudo, the symbol of the Marquess of Santillana, who was the owner. And here we can see the same helmet repeated 4 times. All of these bindings were carried out using the relief technique. In other words, we can see that the helmet sticks out from the flat leather. And the purpose was for this to highlight his ownership of the book. We'll talk very briefly about Italian bindings, although I mentioned them earlier. The Neapolitan kings, above all, Alfonso V, the Magnanimous, and the library of Fernando of Aragon, whom we call the Duke of Calabria. And some research has been done on the bindings of Alfonso V, the Magnanimous. There was an exhibit a few years ago in the University of Valencia, and recently a master's thesis was done in Valencia on the bindings of the Duke of Calabria, and all of them were Mudéjar. We know they were done by Jewish binders in Catalonia and Aragon, and the technique used was the gold plating technique, not in the Iberian Peninsula, but in Naples. These gold-plated Mudéjar bindings appeared in other places. In Italy, in Naples, as we said, first of all, and later in Rome, Florence, Venice, Milan. Those binders emigrated. Those of them who had a Hispanic tradition moved to other places and carried their techniques with them to other cities. And that's why bindings from that Hispano-Arabic tradition began to appear. I say Hispanic-Arabic even though they were done by Jews. And so for that reason, we can find Mudéjar bindings not just on the Iberian Peninsula, but some outside. For example, in the National Library of France in Paris, we find a few. In the British Museum also. In the Copenhagen Library, in the National Library of Austria and Vienna, and other institutions such as the Royal Academy of History of Madrid, in the Cathedral of Toledo, as I mentioned earlier. Some of those Neapolitan bindings here are here. I want to emphasize that we are not using irons. That is, I mean, we're using single pieces of iron, which were embossed on the surface of the binding. Even though everything looks very symmetrical, a large iron was not used. These were separate pieces, scattered pieces of iron, and that really has merit in terms of the work of these binders 5 centuries ago, and we still have them today. And we can see a few of the examples of those bindings. These also are from the Neapolitan period, but they are not gold-plated. We can see that we see the rose-shaped pattern, and here you can see it more in reduced fashion. Here it's that's why the rose is smaller scaled here, and the book is smaller here. And we can see that rose shape better. The central part of the book is decorated with Mudéjar iron, a sort of asp, and you can see this checker shape pattern that I mentioned before. We call this a simple rounded lace. It's a simple lace, but it has a curved pattern. Another type of Neapolitan binding are these two here. One which was embossed without gold, and on the left, one that was embossed with gold. Both may be found in the Cathedral of Toledo, but it says Toledo Cathedral, but the Celada collection. There were 3 collections here. The old collection of Toledo, which belonged to the Toledo, and then there's a Lorenzano collection from a cardinal, Antonio Lorenzano, who lived in Rome, and when he died, in 1688, he donated all his books to the Cathedral of Toledo. And then we have the Celada collection from a Spanish archbishop who was in Rome. And at the end of the 18th century, he donated all his collection of books to the Toledo Cathedral. And in this case, from the Lorenzen collection, there were many books. The content of the books were Hebrew manuscripts, and they may be found in the Cathedral of Toledo. And many of those manuscripts have are from the 18th century, and you can see the heraldic symbol of the Cardinal Celada in the center with his initials there. You can see it. So in terms of the Mudéjar bindings, as I said at the beginning, they were often combined, sometimes combined, with Gothic bindings. The two were contemporary. The Gothic bindings appeared more in the center of Europe, and the Mudéjar more in the Iberian Peninsula, but in some places both styles coexisted. And so we can therefore see bindings with elements of both styles. Here we can see a dragon inside a triangle. This is very Gothic. Here we can see, in this example, we can see an eagle with two birds who are confronting each other, a two-headed eagle, a snake. Here we have an arch. These elements are quite Gothic, which would coexist with more Mudéjar elements. We call these bindings Gothic Mudéjar. Here we see another type of binding, which would be the Mudéjar Renaissance bindings, which came about at the end of the 15th century, the beginning of the 16th century, where we see elements, Mudéjar elements and Mudéjar irons, along with more Renaissance elements, such as these irons with a flower or form with vegetable motifs, which can be found generally in the center of the cover. And to conclude, I wanted to salute all the work to study and recover Mudéjar bindings, which began in the 19th century and which has continued through the 21st century. We have here these neo-Mudéjar bindings, the new Mudéjar bindings with 19th century and 20th century content added. They are part of the retrospective studies, those styles which attempt to recover an old style. We have the neo-Mudéjar, neo-Renaissance, neo-Gothic, in our case, the new neo-Mudéjar bindings. And these were done in the 19th century, in the 20th century, by the best binders that existed in Spain at the time. Many of them of French origin, for example, Pierre Bolin, Pierre Guérin, José Grimaud, and Menard, Antonio Menard. These are some of the best binders in Spain at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century through 1915, which is when they died. And then we had more Spanish binders like Adrian Duran, and there was the workshop of the Nesta, which was a very important workshop in the 19th century, where the father, the son, and the grandson worked together. The Nesta family created that type of bindings. We can see an example of a binding with a flap created by José Grimaud. And one of the most important researchers who began a study on Mudéjar bindings was Ramón Miquel y Planas, with a book which we have there, which is called Restoration of Hispano-Arabic Art. He had a classification of Mudéjar irons created by an illustrator who was just beginning his research work. I'm referring to Joaquim Figueroa. This person was paid, received a scholarship, a subsidy, was sponsored to do calcs of the Mudéjar designs in the main monasteries, libraries of Catalonia. And we can see some of what he created here on the right-hand side of the screen. All of them, as you can see, have a cord-like form. And that would be all I have to say in terms of this small presentation regarding Mudéjar bindings. I hope I didn't go too fast for the interpreter, and I hope that more or less you were able to understand me. And also, I hope to inculcate in you that affection we have for books, for bindings, and in this case, for Mudéjar bindings. So that would be all. And thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Professor Antonio, for a fantastic and colorful presentation. And thanks also to our translator, Daniel, who, after I listened in English, I can testify that it was very clear. Everything was very understandable. At this point, and so next, Antonio, you really whet our appetite for learning more about the bindings, and we hope we can learn much more from you about them. And perhaps even in Israel, we can have you here to visit and learn from you more. I see we can open the floor for questions. So questions can be taken in English or in Spanish. They'll be translated. So, Marianne, did you have a question?
Thank you so much.
Yes.
It was fascinating and very new for me. I have maybe I just missed, but maybe you can a little bit say more about the color of the binding, because I noticed that there are different colors of the binding, and also why Naples in Italy was so special. That's it.
Well, with respect to the color, the bindings normally were sort of a dark red or dark purple. These would be the Mudéjar bindings in Spain, because they were done with this Cordovan leather, which was a goat skin, and that's why they had that dark color. The problem with that leather is that since they were so dark, when they were embossed with the iron on the skin, it's not, you can't see very clearly. You can see them easily if they're gold embossed, but otherwise it's not very clear. The other colors of the leather we saw evolved over decades and they used a little more brownish leather, where you could see the irons that were used for embossing better, but we're not going to see blue leather or green or yellow leather. It's always going to be in these dark tones, this reddish, tawny, brownish color. And why Naples? Because Naples was, how could we call it for us to understand? It was like a Spanish province at the time. And it was part of Spain under the viceroys. the same way we had viceroys in New Spain in South America, in what became Mexico and Colombia. Everywhere there were these viceroys. These were people who were appointed by the king to be the boss, to run that territory. And so in Naples, it was something very similar in the 15th century. This viceroy was used in Naples, in the Americas, and in Rome, and it was part of Spain. And that's why those bindings had that Hispanic air, although later at that time, in that place, they introduced gold. But they had that Spanish air to them because they were done by Aragonese and Catalan binders who were carried there by the kings themselves for them to decorate the bindings for their library.
Thank you.
Great. The floor is open for questions, but I cannot resist asking a question myself at this point. I can think of a few questions, but first let's start out with the Spanish diaspora of Jews from Spain, which going first and primarily to Italy, that we can find findings, the bookbinding technique migrating to Italy. So does it also migrate to other centers of the Spanish Jewish Sephardic diaspora, that being Salonika, Constantinople, Northern Africa? That's where I would expect that we would also find the Mudéjar binder, but is it also found there?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because Italy, as I said before, and Naples specifically, was quote unquote Spanish territory. And so consequently, it was governed by kings and viceroys who were put there by the monarchy, and everything was Hispanic, Spanish. And these artists were carried there to work by the kings. In other places, it was not Spanish territory, and so there were less possibilities for Hispanic binders. Jewish Hispanic binders could go to those places to create that type of bindings. I don't see that as being so viable. Maybe we could find a binding of this type in one of their libraries, but I have no evidence of that being something generalized. There could have been isolated examples, but what would be normal would be for them to be on the Iberian Peninsula and Naples exclusively. That would be the most common.
And then at the same time, what
sorry.
are we finding? Okay, at the same time, what are we finding in other regions of Italy in terms of the bookbinding? Like say in the 15th century. I mean, I'm assuming there's also paperboard, papelon, used, and embossing also, but is it like a later Renaissance style more than the Mudejar style? Is that the difference?
Yeah. In Italy, we will also find, because we're talking about Mudéjar binding above all in Naples, although it was also found in other places because there were binders who emigrated to other places and expanded that technique and that decorative style. But in other places of Italy, until the Renaissance appeared, and the Renaissance style bindings and the Andean style at the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century. We would have Gothic type bindings. We can find them in other parts of Italy as well as in the center of Europe, in France, Germany, Belgium, Holland. We will find the Mudéjar only in one place. In the rest of Italy, we'll find decorative styles, which would also be found in the center of Europe, until there began to be this exchange of decorative elements in Naples, which were similar to what we had on the Iberian Peninsula, and from there they would begin to move to other places.
Okay. Okay, then I have another. Okay, first of all, the floor is open. If anyone has a question, if you can just press the hands button to raise your hand, or you just raise your hand. Also, maybe I'll see. But let me ask one more quick question first. Oh, we have. Okay. I'll say this. I see we have another expert. We have another one of the great experts of Spanish bookbinding here, Maria Diaz, from Toledo. So can you unmute yourself, Maria? Or maybe I can do that. Here, let me see if I ask to unmute. Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
I can hear you, Dolores. Hey, Antonio. First of all, how are you doing? So, first of all, thank you so much. My name is Maria Dolores Diaz de Miranda. It's a compound last name. And Antonio, I had a few questions for you. You say that the background that we can find, you trace these bindings to the 13th century, but nevertheless, yes, the 13th century, right? Yeah, okay. But nevertheless, it seems to me that all the images that you showed were from the 15th century and the 16th century. I don't know. Yes. Okay. All right. So here's my question. It turns out that I'm in Girona. In Girona, I found a type of um, alum bindings with Mudéjar binding. I'm sorry, Mudéjar motifs, and also Gothic motifs. And in terms of the construction, there is a sort of union between the Western and Eastern bindings. It's a special type of sewing pattern. I don't know if you found any type of these bindings in Catalonia. Catalonia is a rather peculiar place for Mudéjar bindings. Why? Because it's in the north of Spain and it's very close to the border with France. And so consequently, there's a big influence from the Central European Gothic currents, and both from the perspective of decoration and from the point of view of construction. There is going to be those currents from the center of Europe. At the same time, I was saying that Catalonia was a very wealthy center for bindings, because there we're going to find those bindings that we saw with the lace patterns, with those circles where you could see the circle with petals. That's where I found the greatest number of that type of bindings, the Catalan Aragonese bindings. And it's true what Maria Dolores is saying, that during the 14th century, because what we saw was above all from the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century, especially the 15th century, which was the apogee of the flourishing of the Mudéjar style. We also had things in the 14th century. And regarding a binding, as she said, with leather that was tanned with alum, which was mixed with Gothic irons. And so the Catalonia was connected to the other side of Europe over the Pyrenees. And that's why in Catalonia we can find those Gothic Mudéjar bindings. And we're also going to start to find that type of decoration or construction in terms of the seams, in terms of this chain sewing, because Catalonia was a peculiar area for that. We're not going to find that in Seville, for example, or in Granada, or in Salamanca, or in Toledo. We're going to find that more in that northern part of Spain, which you are perfectly acquainted with, because in the University Library of the Historical Library of the University of Barcelona, they have a very good collection of Mudéjar bindings, and I know they've been taking photos of these bindings, and part of their collection is posted on the internet. And so what you say is right. In that century, in the 14th century, that type of characteristics was present because of the proximity to Europe above all. But Antonio, I would come up with a second follow-up question, which is to say, regarding the origin we could be found more. Where does this style of binding originate? Could we talk about the fact that it's from someplace in Catalonia where there were Jewish nuclei, for example, in Girona, where there were very important Jewish communities? Well, in terms of the origin, we know that the Mudéjar bindings had that Arabic influence. Well, Arabic influence, that was a great part of the Iberian Peninsula. Above all, I think it began to occur in those large cities where there was that cultural exchange among different religions, the Jewish, the Muslim, and the Christian religions. And that's where I believe that type of decoration began to be created, which had that great Arabic influence from the Islamic bindings, and it began to change to come up with that decoration, which wasn't so Arabic, but it was created initially by Arab binders or Arabic binders, but quickly the Jewish binders began to do the bindings, because the term Mudéjar is a modern term. They didn't call the bindings them that way. That term was coined in the 19th century. So for them, this was a binding format that evolved, and they acquired, and they began to use it because that's what the market was requesting. That's what was in style. And they did it because they were good. In Barcelona and places, there is documentation in the archives where it is explained that it were the Jewish bookbinders who did that type of bindings. Arsenio Sanchez studied that, and we were able to corroborate that. And we saw that in the study that we did in our 2013 catalog. I think that's the origin. It began to evolve from those Arab style bindings. It evolved from Arab binders at the outset to other binders who adapted it, and it began. And these new Jewish binders became specialists, and they had their own neighborhoods, their own quarters, their own associations, their own trade groups, guilds among themselves, among the Jews. where they were dedicated to that type of bindings.
They had guilds?
I really must thank Lior. When Lior told me about this, I can't miss.
We should introduce Maria Diaz to the group also, that she runs a restoration studio in Toledo at the hospital run by the Medici Foundation. And she's also the author of several articles describing book bindings in Girona and Hebrew manuscripts from book bindings. And anyone visiting Toledo, I highly recommend paying her a visit. She also has classes and videos, and she's a great expert on the construction, the internal construction of these medieval books. So now, okay, let me steal the floor again for another question. Antonio, you mentioned the three groups, typological groups: Toledo, Salamanca, and Catalan-Aragans. These three, yeah, the three groups. Then, right, then you discussed the bands, the books with rectangular bands, and it was unclear to me. First of all, those are a kind that I'm dealing with a lot with the Catalonian notary books, that we have those. I always understood that the bands, that those were a subtype of the Catalonia-Aragonese type, like, but if I understood correctly from you, you view them as an alternative type, like a fourth type. It's unclear to me if they're a subgroup or a separate type or a related separate type, or I don't understand.
Yes. In our classification, we have a first large group where the bindings that have lace patterns. Inside those lace patterns,
can you show the image of the three types on the screen? So that, thank you.
So this would be the Toledan type. These are the threads which are interlinked, and in the center they create a rose-shaped pattern or a circle. That's the Toledo group. It doesn't mean that they were done in Toledo, but that's how they're called. Another group is the Salamanca group, where we create geometric forms such as rectangles or squares and rhombus. And all of this is part of the same group of lace patterns. These threads which crisscross each other. And the third group, this is the second group, and the third group is of these threads, of these laces, which would create these four petaled flowers, these ovals with petals. This would be the third group, which would we call Catalan Aragonese. That would be one large group, which has three subtypes. The next group, which is a separate group, is the one of the rectangular bands. And there's no reason for this to be Catalan Aragonese. It could be found throughout the Aragonese, the Iberian Peninsula. It's very simple. Some threads around the cover as if it were a frame, and the rest was indicated through these irons. And this was the simplest and the most popular, and then we could say the less ostentatious and the less gaudy. these rectangular bands, and then we have
hence it would be found. Hence it would be found more in the. If I could interrupt, I'm sorry, because it's less ostentatious. So we would find it more in the notary books rather than the ecclesiastical books or regal books, which might be more ostentatious. The more simple notarial accounting books would tend toward the rectangular bands style generally. I'm not speaking absolutely, but generally. But the rectangular aspect seems very strong in the Catalonia are against model. Like the rectangles jump out at you, whereas in the first two models, they don't. There's a much more complex lacing pattern where there's no real the rectangular aspect is not so dominant. That's why I'm asking if there's some kind of relation.
Okay, look, first of all, the binding at this time was not so linked to the content of the book. It's not, I could have a book, ecclesiastical book, or a book of astronomy or any other subject, and it could have Mudéjar binding. What did one type or another depend on? Who asked for it and how much money they want to spend. If we look, these lace pattern bindings were very luxurious. It required very meticulous design because many small irons had to be embossed onto the surface. And here for this type of decoration within the Mudéjar style is the least elaborated because simply these bands and the repetitive use of the irons and maybe a small decoration on the inside. These are the least elaborate decorations from the perspective of design. And this could be used for books that were of lesser importance. For example, accounting books. In the Cathedral of Toledo, we also have the books these books, a collection of books that were for accounting of expenses in the cathedral over the centuries, called Obra y Fábrica, the works and the factory. The same books we have in the Cathedral of Toledo, the same type of bindings, they came from the same workshops, the same decoration with the color bands, and all of these are the design is the same, and they all use flexible parchment with a flap. And it's true that in the Toledo Cathedral, inside that collection of accounting books, not all of them were of parchment, but we also find Mudéjar, simple Mudéjar bindings with these boundaries, but they would be rebindings that were bindings of parchment that had deteriorated and could have broken, and they were rebound with Mudéjar styles. We have a few examples, not many of them, but there are some examples from that time. And I think, as you do, that type of decoration, if the person wanted to pay for it, would pay for a Mudéjar binding, but he would pick an economic format that involved less work.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes. Okay. Exactly. Thank you, Antonio. I see we're getting short on time. So this is the last call for a question from the audience. Do we have any additional questions? Okay. In that case, I think we will wrap up here. We've eaten up all of our time. So thank you, Antonio, for this introduction to
Let me thank you.
Fascinating aspect of Spanish culture and shared Spanish and Jewish culture. We're very grateful for your time and your attention. So we'll remind everyone also that next week we'll be meeting for the next seminar.
Yes, I am here.
Do you know
yes,
who
thank
will
you,
be speaking
Laura.
next
Thank
week?
you, Laura. So I invite everybody to our next lecture, which will be next week, same time, in which will be a lecture by Ruth